Like any company, like you want to make sure that your employees enjoy working at the company, like, and that's the context through which I view like, hey, you're the boss, not like be a dick to people, but like you need to treat people well and be a good leader and kind of help set the culture for your business.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 239. This is the one where we talk all about building a team and specifically avoiding one pitfall or trap that I think can often happen along the way and can leave your team members, especially your manager, feeling unappreciated or overworked or out of their sphere of influence. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy, and with me is your co-host, Mr. Ed Isola. Ed, what's up, dude?
Not much, honestly. Just excited to kind of dive into this because I think it is something that is going to be really insightful for whether, artists that have a management team or a label or bands that maybe don't have that but are looking forward to it. I think it's going to help kind of outline some ways to really view, really view your business as a business. And as a starting point, recognize that anybody else that you bring on to your business, whether it's a management team, anybody, they technically work for you as the artist and as the owner of your business, unless you sell everything away to a label. They're technically employees of your business. And I think that that's an important thing to kind of have in your mind as we start this conversation, because a lot of people, I don't think that way. I think that it kind of becomes a like, oh, whatever they want to do kind of mentality, which I think can be harmful.
Yeah, we see that. I see that a lot for sure, especially artists who sign. All of a sudden, it's like, the label's my boss. I need to ask permission. It's like, no, if you have, if you've done your work, like the leverage is yours, hopefully. And it's a partnership. It's a partnership of working together to make decisions, to move things in the right direction, to find more opportunities. It's not like, oh, let me go ask dad,
Right. Yeah. And I'm even thinking about this from a, like, when I say, that your team works for you as the artist, I don't say that in like a condescending, like, oh, look, you're the boss man or woman of your business, but more from a like, I mean, you are, but like more from the standpoint of like, you should be a good boss, right? You should be collaborative. You should be making sure that the people on your team, your managers, your social media people, your tour crew, your tour manager, your bandmates, like you should be making sure that all of these people who are invested in the success of your business are feeling good, are feeling excited, are feeling like they have clarity on what they should do and that they feel valued. Because I think a lot of artists kind of potentially might bring people on and then say, all right, cool, you do that, I'm going to go make an album, and like you deal with everything else. And we're going to dive into this, but it's like teams deal with a lot of stuff across the board. And I know you said this before we started, like artists maybe don't realize how much managers and teams do. And so like, I just, as an artist myself with a team at this point, like I feel super responsible for making sure that one, people know I appreciate them, but two, like they enjoy, like any company, like you want to make sure that your employees enjoy working at the company, like, and that's the context through which I view like, hey, you're the boss, not like be a dick to people, but like you need to treat people well and be a good leader and kind of help set the culture for your business.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good starting off point here, is to be like I think the foundational reasoning and even wanting to have this conversation around this topic is like, how can you be a good leader in your music business as the CEO and the founder of your music business? How can you make sure that the people that you're bringing on that will be invested in your success, like you said, are one, taken care of, and are two, like enabled and set forth to really work in their lane of expertise or their sphere, their biggest sphere of influence. And I think that can that's the biggest trap that people can fall into. I was having a conversation not too long ago with a friend of ours and someone that we're fortunate enough to work with at the agency with some of our clients, Dame Ritter. He's the founder of the Music Entrepreneur Club, and he's an artist manager and he manages creatives. And he's one of the hardest working people I know. Like, if he's listening to this, he's probably bashful and shy, but he's such a hardworking guy and is so invested in the success of the people that he works with. But we've had plenty of conversations before in the past about like, yeah, artists and bands don't necessarily know how hard their team, whether it be their manager or anybody else on their team, how hard they're really working and how many things they're doing, how many plates they're spinning. And that can be really hard on a team, for one. And also it can kind of be a detriment if you're not allowing people to really be doing the things that they are best at doing for you. And I often think about Dame when we have conversations like this, because I just know like he's willing to go above and beyond for people. We'll link to the MEC in the show notes so that you guys can check out the Music Entrepreneur Club, because they have some great content on music business as well. So definitely shout out to Dame as we kind of talk about what managers deal with, because I've seen managers working with people at the agency, working with artists and bands there. I've seen managers that, you know, they take over social media, they take over writing emails, they take over scheduling content, booking tours, coordinating everything, doing tour advancing, logistics, all of that stuff, which in many cases they're happy to do, but it really takes them out of like the stuff that they are good at, and were brought on to the team to really function as an important lever to.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like the thing with teams is that, like you said, you bring people on and they typically have a scope, which is for the reason that you're bringing them on. Like we'll probably talk a lot throughout this episode, or at least I will frame it as like, as a business runs, and people hire employees to businesses because they're good at something specifically. You know, like I didn't start working at Entrepreneur just because it was like, you like music, right? It was like, you are good at this thing. We need that thing. You're on the team essentially. And that's the same way, like what you just said, is like managers are typically, they are the people that buy into the artist and the vision earlier than a lot of people, I think. And so they're kind of not on the stage playing, but they are out there really grinding and trying to make those connections and help grow and run the business and like setting that groundwork in the belief that, hey, in the future, this thing's going to like continue to grow and that kind of thing. And so I think one of the biggest potential pitfalls is like one, overloading managers and like I said, kind of treating it as if like, hey, they're on their own and like I don't have to concern myself with any of this stuff. And two, like Jack just said, like you want to let people do what they're good at. And if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your business, I'm not saying you have to micromanage. In fact, I think that if you start to micromanage, that is detrimental. Like I think that big artists get that way because they trust the people on their team. And they check in, but like it's more of a like, hey, you're good at this, I trust you, go do it, and then like let's check in and see how it's going, kind of thing. And so they really, in big businesses, right, they empower their people, their employees to do what they're good at, and typically that pays off dividends. So like as an artist, I think the first thing is like, one, thinking about it as the fact, like Jack said, you are the CEO of this company. At a certain point, your job will switch from like doing everything and being the point person on everything to more so empowering people and checking in and seeing how they're doing, seeing how things are flowing, trying to look for bigger opportunities for the business. But like there is that pivot point that I think is super, super important to outline. And like really to me, the checking in is starting to become more relevant, and the letting go. You know, like we've done so much for so long that it's like, wow, okay, well, I was on the phone with a manager for one of the IndieX clients the other day. He's like, yeah, you know, the biggest problem with the growth of this artist is that they want to oversee every single thing, whether it's an email, whether it's a copy, whether it's a merch design, whether it's a contract, like a financial statement, a expense. Like they want to oversee everything and okay everything to the point where it's grinding and it's difficult for the business to grow because people can't make decisions on their own. And that's something where I think people kind of have to be super aware of. And like there's a balance here of wanting to oversee everything and trusting people, but also not overloading the team. That's where I am starting to think about it as like, look, see what people can take on their plate, check in with them after a month or two, get an honest, have conversations with people. So like, how are you feeling? And if it feels like it's too much, too little, adapt from there, but don't be afraid to bring people on. Like nobody should feel like if I don't do this, I'm a failure. Like the end of the day, everybody wants the business to succeed and you want people on your team. They're going to work hard, but also communicate with you on how they're feeling. So things are light and fluid and growing and not like bogged down and very difficult.
Yeah. And in addition to that, I think a big pitfall is in addition to being micromanaging, like the opposite is also true, where you sort of let go of everything and all of a sudden, you know, the new manager that just came onto your team for the first time is overloaded with doing a lot more than what a manager is really best at doing. You know, they find themselves doing your social media posts. They find themselves writing your copy. They find themselves, you know, coordinating your personal schedule and things like that. That really, like, in reality, when most artists and bands talk about wanting a manager, those are not the reasons that they want to have a manager. They want a manager for the opportunities that they can bring to the table, for growth, how they can be a connector, how they can help them network into new places that they, you know, were previously gate kept out of. And when all of these things load up on someone who that's not really their lane, you find yourself in a place where it's like, one, those things are getting done at like a lower effectiveness than how they usually would if they were distributed correctly to the right team members. And again, then you find yourself not actually getting the opportunities that you want and not getting the value that you wanted from the relationship that you're trying to build.
Right. And then you're like, I'm not getting the value I want from this relationship. Therefore, let me, you know, sever that relationship. Let me move on. Let me try something else. But that most likely that pattern is going to repeat itself because it's like, if you go with a partner, maybe there's a world where like they're just doing that bad of a job that it's not tenable and you can't stay with them, right? But like I would bet that a lot of times the problems come from the fact that, okay, you make the decision to go with somebody, like Jack said, if you're partnering up with a label or a manager or a management firm or something like that, or a booking agent, like what you really want from them, I would guess, is, like Jack said, the connections and the opportunity and the expansion of your brand. And if you do your proper vetting, your partner is probably going to be very good and very connected. And like, depending on where you're at in your career, like obviously varying levels of that. But like, if you take the time and you do the research, you're probably making a good decision on who's a good fit for you right now. So I would say 90% of the time, the whole angle of like, let me try. And if it's not working, let me just cut the ties and move on. If you do that, it's probably worth examining why things weren't working.
Ooh, yeah. You got to look in the mirror.
Exactly what I was going to say. I would venture to guess that when things aren't working with these very reputable agents or firms or labels, like it has to do with how the artist is managing expectations and how the artist is communicating and all that kind of stuff. Because these people, like, it's not, unless you just hire somebody off the street or right out of school, like, these firms and companies, like, they're successful. They have artists that they help and that they build. And so that to me is where you got to remove your ego as an artist of like, how do I work within this system? How do I grow? Right. Because that's to me, the place where it's like, you have to be collaborative. And it's like any merging of any business, whether you're bringing somebody into your business or you're joining up with a company and you're saying, here's how we've done things, here's how you do things. Like, you have to have these conversations and figure out what the system looks like for everybody involved to feel good about it. And that's not a quick thing, but it's also something that you have to be willing to be like, hey, let's try this. Okay, this is what's working, this is what's not working. Let's reset and try it this way, right? Because at the end of the day, you have great people on your team, you have great people in your band, and all those great people can get great results together if you take the time to figure out how they work together. And obviously every situation's unique, but like that's something I'm realizing myself is like, man, you really gotta never been through a business merger before, and you really kind of have to realize what are people's strengths, what do they like doing, what do you want them to do, what do they want from you, and have these conversations and like hash that out, because I'm a big believer that open lines of communication and a system where everybody feels that they're contributing and able to make decisions and move things quickly is a system that allows for the band to be creative and the band to grow.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think like one of the biggest things that I've noticed over the years of working with managers and working with artists and bands is like whenever conversations or frustrations come up with those kinds of two parties, I feel like it often is related to like mismatched expectations, for one, on the side of the artist not understanding or having, totally misaligned expectations of what they can achieve with a manager. The second thing is like overwhelm, for sure. Like someone brings on a manager and all of a sudden they just forget about the fact that they have a job to do, in their business. And we talked about this a little bit in last week's episode where we were talking about, maintaining your voice online and how when you offload work, that can get lost and all of a sudden you don't sound like yourself in certain places anymore. We kind of started touching on this topic a little bit of like what lane your team members should be living in. And that's one thing that I think is very common and a point of friction that comes up between artists and their managers or their teams or whoever it might be. And that's kind of point number one. And the other thing that often comes up is just people feeling, pushed into a lane that isn't theirs. Like you said, Ed, unless like it's just a terrible relationship where someone misrepresented themselves at the outset and then you brought them in and they were just absolutely not who they said they were going to be. Those are two big reasons that I think like relationships get tense and problematic, and all of a sudden a business comes grinding to a halt or problems start to surface. It's just like the lines of communication become clogged up. The workload shifts over to one side more than it should. And then people aren't really allowed to flex their muscles in the areas where they can actually do a great job and bring a ton of value. And so, yeah, I think that's really important. I'm curious of your experience as you guys have been building a team with the 502s. What has been the cycle of resetting looked like and like being diagnostic about it and finding ways to reconfigure when you need to, instead of just pointing fingers and being like, this isn't working out?
Yeah, but it's been super collaborative, which is really nice because, the band is 2016 we started, 2022, so the band's 6 or 7 years old, give or take. And through last year, so 5 or 6 years, essentially the band has operated with us being the main everything, right? Like the main advertisers, the main marketers, the main songwriters, the main social media coordinators, the main booking agents, like the main travel logistics people. Anything that was happening with the 502s, the band was doing it. We didn't have a manager. We acted as our own manager essentially. And we've partnered with like a, world-class management company, and they're awesome. And they definitely have like helped us, and we've seen a bunch of wins together this year already. And the tour is growing, the business is growing, and like everything is trending upwards. And it's really exciting. And it's also a really interesting time because while everything's trending upwards, we're 6 months into our relationship together and we're still hashing out like, hey, here's kind of who should be responsible for this, and here's who's responsible for that. And I think what's cool about it is everybody is super collaborative, and it's not like, hey, back off or like that kind of thing. It's like you said, it's like when we first were like, hey, we're going to work together, we understood what they were really good at. And they also understood that as a band, we like to have our hands on some of the business. Like a lot of times it almost would be easier, I think, if we were just a little bit unplugged from it, but they've never asked that of us. They've always been like, look, we know you guys are into it. We know you guys have input and ideas about stuff. So like, let's work on it. Let's figure it out. And it's been a totally natural progression of like, let's try this. How did everyone feel about it? Okay, this piece worked. This piece doesn't work. Eddie, you kind of got in the way on this thing. Like, we need you to back off of that. Like, it's very open, no ego, and just kind of like, let's hash it out. Let's figure it out. Because at the end of the day, everybody wants to see the band succeed, right? And I think what's really cool too is that inside the band, we have people that want to be involved. And so we're kind of able to delegate some of our brand voice type stuff and emails and some coordination inside the band and kind of keep this tight circle of management and band where, again, things are ever changing. As the 502s are growing, things have to change. And right now we have certain band member is helping do tour logistics. If the band doubles in size next year, there's no way he'll be able to do that with shows and tours and that kind of stuff. And so I think the takeaway here is, for me, and what I've seen is really like kind of what I've already said in this episode is like open lines of communication, trust you're with the right people, trust that they're good at their jobs, and then ask questions too. That's the thing I'm learning a lot as we go through this process is like, it's not a good move for me to just show up and be like, here's what I like to do. Let's do that. Like, there's people on our team now that are way more experienced than me in a lot of different things. And we're making more progress when I ask the question of like, hey, here's how I would typically do it. Like, what do you guys think? How would you guys do it? And that doesn't mean that their response is like, that's doctrine. That's what we're doing. But it opens the conversation for me to understand, well, here's where they're coming from. And here's where I'm coming from. And like, how do we meet the middle ground there and probably take two good ideas together? And like I said, they're awesome. And it's the process of working through everybody's interests so that the band can grow that I think is honestly one of the most exciting parts of like, man, I can feel it on my fingertips. Like, we're growing, but once we sort out a couple things and like, honestly, I kind of get out of the way of a couple things. I think I said this last episode, but like, I'm realizing there's things that maybe I'm not the most expert at that I think I'm the most expert at. And I kind of have to, go from being the one who was doing everything to just being like, look, actually you do know this better than me. And like, however hard it is for me to take my fingers off of it, I need to, so it grows. Like, that's kind of a cool, exciting process because I can see long-term how the legwork we're doing now together sets the foundation for the continued growth on all fronts.
That's a really good point. I think asking questions is like the key to collaborating with a team. And I'm going to go out there on a limb and just venture to say this. And I'd be actually really curious to hear what you think about this hypothesis that I have, Ed, because I'm sure some people would disagree with me. But I think the number one question that you can ask when building a team and continuing that relationship with a team, like this is a question that you should be asking as you're going through the process, is where do you think you can bring value to the thing that we're doing? Like, where would you be happiest and where do you think you can really like knock something out of the park with XYZ thing that we're working on? Where do you think you can bring the most value to this tour that we're working on? Where do you think you can bring value to the upcoming record that we're working on? And that really allows you to, I think, align at the beginning when you're starting a relationship with someone, whether it's a manager or a record label or an agency like us or a new band member, whatever it might be, a social media manager, a content creator, like assistant, whatever it might be. The question that you would ask is like, what value do you think you can bring based on your skill set? Ask that. And then as you're getting things configured and people are slotting into roles, continue to ask like, do you think what you're working on is allowing you to bring the most value that you think you can bring? And if not, then maybe you need to reset and reconfigure like you were talking about. But I think that that's like one of the most important questions that you could possibly ask.
Dude, absolutely. And I think what ties into that very closely is asking that question, getting that answer. And like you said early in the episode, letting people do that job. Like that's something that I think that we kind of were at fault at, was like being like, oh, great, we're working together. Please take literally everything and handle it now. And it was like, oh, well,
that's the fatal error, dude.
Yeah, and it's like, well, that's a lot of stuff, right? Like all of a sudden it becomes almost too much stuff to handle unless we start hiring other people on to help handle it. And so now we've reached this nice middle ground of like, oh, look, we do some of these things, but like what you're really good at is A, B, and C. And what we really want you to do is A, B, and C. So I'm more than happy to help on social media if that means you're getting us into Bonnaroo. Like that, like that kind of thing. Where it's
yeah, totally.
So anyways, that's kind of my thought is like, and that's the whole, you ask what's been the resetting and reconfiguring. It's like, well, trying to just get into the habit of working together. And that's where, like I said, if you're with a good partner, it's probably not the partner, and it's probably more likely the way the artist is approaching things, and just making sure that everybody approaches it from a collaborative standpoint, I think is like a really key piece.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also like how this episode, like when we were initially talking about this pre-roll, it was like, oh man, this might come off as like touchy and maybe even a little antagonistic, but I feel like the topic really morphed as we were having this conversation into like, how do you just be more collaborative? Like, yeah, you want to avoid these traps, and the way that you can avoid them is by asking questions, is by being collaborative, and is by having an open line of communication. And really, like, that will solve, 90% of your problems when building a team are going to be solved by doing those things. And then you just let people be in their lane.
Right, exactly. And it's like, just kind of assume like, don't assume you don't know nothing, or you don't, if that's the right way to say that, but like maybe assume that you don't know all the angles to approach a problem. That's a good way to say it. Like there might be a better, more direct way to handle something than whatever you think. And if you have good people around you, you have to trust that they're going to give you an honest input, and they might have a better approach than you. And at which point, like, you got to remove yourself or step back and let people run with what they're good at. I think that's really, really important when it comes to partnerships and that kind of stuff.
Well said. Well, hopefully these ideas will help give you guys, whether you're building a team for the very first time, whether you have a team and you're working through the growing pains of everything involved in running a music business with more than just you and maybe your bandmates, hopefully these will give you some context and some frameworks and some tools, and just maybe like a psychological shift to take in your mindset when running your business to, relieve some stress, relieve some tension, and really, like, most importantly, get everyone working together effectively and doing damage, working on the things that are going to drive everything forward together, and really letting people be in their lane and pull out new opportunities and wins for you.
Well said. Well said indeed.
Hell yeah. Well, we'll catch you guys next time on Creative Juice. Peace out, Indies.